Welcome everybody to the September series, the second class of Let's Cook with Apples. I'm very excited to see you all. I'm Gail Schorsch, founder and director of Bronx Eats, and I am so pleased that you have chosen to spend part of your evening with us tonight. It's really nice to see people returning and to see old faces and also new faces. So welcome to the growing Bronx Eats community. To those of you celebrating, Happy New Year to you. Food is a great reason to get together, and Bronx Eats is here to offer you healthy plant-based foods that you know and love, and also to introduce you to some dishes that you may not have thought to try. Small steps towards a healthier plant-based diet can build on itself. Bronx Eats is a safe place to meet, learn, and connect with each other around food and cooking, a shared community gathering space. We need to make sure that we find ways to connect with each other, especially during COVID times when it is easy to feel disconnected and alone. When we come together for events like this, we send a message to ourselves and to others that our health matters to us and that we value our time together in community, that we value our local cooks and chefs, and that we're going to take care of ourselves on a personal and a community level. So thank you for showing up for yourselves and for this community. A big thank you to Giselle Payne and to Barbara Denson from RSS, who helped to plan and organize this series. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording this presentation. You may ask questions directly of Desiree, or if you prefer to use the chat box to ask your questions, that's totally fine too. Also, it really makes it more personal and connected if you can turn your video on. Your presence is very important to us, and it makes it feel more like a community and a family if you have your video on. So this is a class, but it's also a chance to share with and learn from each other face to face. So please turn your videos on if possible. And now let me introduce Chef Desiree Rodriguez, who we are truly honored to have here tonight. So Desiree switched to a plant-based diet for health reasons because she experienced firsthand the healing benefits of eating nutrient-dense food and knew she couldn't go back to her old eating habits. While loving what a plant-based diet did for her body, she still missed eating the Puerto Rican dishes her family would make that were delicious but not the healthiest. She started incorporating Latin seasonings into her plant-based meals and loved the way the food tasted. She wanted to help others create delicious plant-based meals without sacrificing the flavors, so she created the food blog Rican Vegan. Desiree creates healthy plant-based versions of traditional Latin dishes for her blog so that she can inspire more people to make the switch and experience the health benefits for themselves while enjoying flavorful food at the same time. So head over to ricanvegan.com for more of her recipes. And without further ado, I want to thank and welcome Chef Desiree Rodriguez.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you everyone for joining. Today, we're going to be making an apple butternut squash soup, which is perfect for fall, which is pretty much just a few weeks away. And all of the ingredients that I'm using in this soup are all in season right now. So they'll actually taste a whole lot better when you make them in season. So right now, I'm going to actually chop up the butternut squash and I'm going to peel it. So I have here half of a butternut squash. So I'm just going to grab my peeler and just peel it, which basically you want to just, get the peel off. If you want, you could take the seeds from a butternut squash. You could actually roast them. They make a really good snack if you don't want to waste them. Or if you have space, you could try to grow your own butternut squash, even though probably won't recommend that in the Bronx, but in Miami, we did try to do that and it actually worked. We were able to basically grow our own little butternut squash. Unfortunately, it was too small to make, into a soup, but we were actually surprised that it worked. We took the seeds from it and just, put it in some soil in our backyard. And within a few months, we had a little squash.
Beautiful. And for those of you, I didn't mention, if you go to Desiree's box to the top right corner and click on the 3 dots and pin her, then her screen will appear the largest on your screen. And that's helpful for being able to follow what she's up to.
Yep. So now that I peeled it, we're going to just chop it into we're going to dice it into pretty, decent sized chunks. but it's important to make sure that all of the pieces are the same size so they cook evenly. So just gonna chop it up right here. And also for butternut squash, since now you can find them pretty cheap. I don't know about in the Bronx, but over here in Florida, they're actually pretty long. So this is like the perfect time to get a butternut squash and just take advantage of all of the squash recipes you can get your hands on.
Yeah. And that's what we mean by eating seasonally, right? Buying things that are fresh in the season. Luciana has asked about pinning. So if you go to Desiree Rodriguez's box and you go to the top right corner and you see the 3 dots, if you click on that, there's an option to pin her video, and then she will appear larger.
So because of time, we have actually the butternut squash already cooking, but I wanted to show you basically just, you're gonna chop them into like these dice, size pieces. And when you're cooking them, you wanna make sure that, not only are they even size, but also fork tender, because it's gonna be important when you, at the end of the soup, we're gonna blend it together. So you really want the squash to be really soft. It's like, if possible, that it's when you pierce a fork through it, it's really, really, it just slides right through.
Okay, but just to clarify, you're talking about after it's cooked. Desiree is going to put it in water and bring it to a boil. And then the way you know that it's done is by poking a fork into the 1 or 2 of the pieces. And when the pieces really do have to be soft, otherwise you're not going to get a really nice soup consistency.
Right.
So Desiree, do you need any kind of special knife or anything unusual to do what you're doing? I know some people see butternut squash already chopped up in the supermarket. Is that
Right.
something that you recommend, or are you recommending that people go with the fresh option?
If you're, short on time, I do recommend, that helps a lot. The only thing with that is you don't know how long it's been sitting in the bag. You don't know how long ago that was chopped. So if you really want it fresh, I would recommend, just getting the butternut squash, the whole one, and just cutting it yourself. I do recommend that you sharpen your knife beforehand, because it can be very hard if it's, if you have a dull knife, to cut through them.
And before you started peeling the squash, did you cut off both the ends of the squash?
Yes. So I cut off both ends of the squash, and then I removed the seeds with a spoon. And then you just peel it and then just chop it down into the smaller pieces.
And will this recipe work with any kind of squash? I know tonight we're doing a butternut squash apple soup, but if I wanted to buy a different kabocha squash or another kind of, there's so many types of squashes available now in the supermarket. Would that be okay?
Yes, that would be totally fine.
So it's good to know that, because people tend to think everything is so rigid and fixed and you have to do it like this or otherwise it'll be terrible. Turns out it's not true. Any squash you feel excited to peel, you can probably make this soup and follow the same recipe. Is that correct?
Exactly. So now I'm gonna peel and cut the carrots. So this recipe calls for 2. I already have some boiling, so I'm just gonna do this one. But any carrot will do, it's nothing, you can always find these year round, so that's not a problem. But fall is carrot season as well, so they should be a lot cheaper to get in the supermarket.
And there is a question about where you can get that cool peeler you're using.
I actually got this peeler in Marshall's. So if you have, if you go to either Marshall's, I mean, you may have to look a while, because Marshall's, sometimes you can't find everything the first time you go, but either Marshall's or TJ Maxx, since they're owned by the same company. Definitely that's why I got this, because yeah, it's so much better. And this is actually pretty sharp for a peeler. So I love doing it because, you don't have to worry about your hand getting in the way. And then I'm just going to cut the carrots kind of into smaller pieces. Also make sure that they're the same size so that it cooks evenly through.
So while you're doing that, Desiree, there are a few questions that came in. I'm not sure you can answer, but there's someone who hasn't had butternut squash and wants you to maybe describe what it tastes like. And the other question is, what's the difference between squash and zucchini?
So zucchini, okay, so the first question, what was the first question? It was
what does it taste like? I was
What was
going to say it's similar to sweet potato, but
Right.
squash is a little bit harder, takes a little longer to cook, I would say.
Exactly. It's in the, yes, it's in the squash family. So it's similar to sweet potatoes, but I would say it's more of a nutty flavor. And the difference between this and a zucchini, definitely, the texture of a zucchini is much softer compared to butternut squash. So you could cook it much faster, and you can saute it, as well as you could roast it. And actually for this recipe, as an alternative option, you can roast the butternut squash instead of boiling it. It will give it like a deeper flavor when you're roasting, but it's also an option too. So if you like roasted vegetables much, much better, you could do that as well. As long as you cook it, it'll be so much better. But for time's sake, we could just put it in the pot to boil.
Okay, so I'm just going to review what you said. Right now, she's cutting it up into pieces and then going to boil it until it gets soft. But if you wanted that roasted flavor, you would cut it up the exact same way and maybe toss it in a little bit of olive oil and then roast it?
Yeah, you could toss it with a little bit of salt and olive oil.
A little bit of salt and olive oil, put it in the oven for maybe half an hour. Again, put a fork in until it's soft and use it in the same way the recipe calls for. And that'll give it a little bit of, as Desiree is saying, a kind of roasted flavor.
Right. So now I'm going to peel, cut, and core my apple. So I'm using a Honeycrisp apple. What's important about the apple is that it needs to be one of the firmer types of apples. So either a Honeycrisp, Pink Lady apple, or Granny Smith, or Fuji apple. Those will be like the best types of apples to use with this recipe. So if you can't find Honeycrisp, you can find one of the other ones as well. So I'm going to peel it first. And I love to put apples in this recipe because it gives it a nice sweetness to it. And this one's a pretty large apple. So if you can't find one as big, 2 smaller apples will do as well.
And again, notice Desiree is being flexible. You can't find a Granny Smith, so use a Fuji. And if you can't find a Fuji, a Honeycrisp is fine. It really just sweetens the soup. You don't have to be completely fixated on one particular kind of apple.
Right. Because you want to make sure also it's one of the firmer ones, because it has to hold up during the cooking process. You don't want it to fall apart in the middle, of cooking. So that's why it's recommended to always use one of those types of apples when cooking with apples.
Right. And again, the beauty of this recipe is that apples are now seasonal. So the squash is seasonal, the apples are seasonal, and you're really eating the freshest produce available right now.
Right. And it's apple picking season. I used to go to upstate New York and do apple picking every year around this time. So if you're able to do that, I don't know about with COVID now, how that's gonna be, but we would always get like a huge bag of apples, and that would last us about a month or 2. So you could do that as well. So pretty much I have my apple peeled. So what I'm going to use is an apple corer to kind of slice it and core it in the middle. If you don't have that, regular knife will do. But this actually save so much time when you're cooking. And you can see this
So
apple is
Judith Satoski is saying she can't see. So could you go to the top right of Desiree's picture and just click on the three dots and pin? It says pin her video, and then her screen will come up the largest. And let me know how that goes. Haiti is commenting, you can get a very good squash soup at Panera during autumn season.
That is true. That is actually a very good soup. I do like it a lot.
But we're really learning to make pretty much the equivalent. Honestly, the homemade soups, I think, taste even better than what you can buy in the store, and they for sure cost less. You can have this delicious soup for, several days and probably pay the same amount as one little pint at Panera.
So even though the core, slice the apples, I'm just cutting them further down so that it'll cook much more evenly and quicker.
Well, that's an important cooking tip also, right? Desiree
Yes.
saying the smaller you chop your ingredients, the faster they're going to cook. A lot of people don't realize that, but even if you're roasting, if you're boiling, if you're roasting, it doesn't matter. It's going to cook faster if you've cut up your vegetables smaller, just because there's more surface space for the heat to hit. And Barbara makes an important point that homemade soup has less salt too.
Yes.
That's very true. When you make things yourself, you have control over how much salt, how much sugar, how much spices, right? And it's really very empowering once you do it a few times to feel like, oh, well, maybe I don't need that much salt, or maybe I don't need that much sugar. And so that's a great point, Barbara. Thank you.
Exactly. And the more you make your own food, the more your taste buds actually change. And then you realize you don't need as much salt or as much sugar as you thought you needed before. And even then, if you go out to eat, you'll notice that that food is actually way too much, has way too much salt and sugar. And it's just not even, sometimes like I can't even eat that type of food because there's just too much extra salt and sugar in it. So now that I have everything chopped, I'm going to go over to my stove and actually start cooking the apples and the onions, as well as start to season it. So I'm going to come here and actually I'm going to heat my pot. So I'm using a large pot because I'm going to cook everything in here and cook the soup as well once we have it going.
Okay, so as you're doing that, I have a few more questions, Desiree.
Sure.
One is, how long will this soup last once it's all cooked? Can you freeze it and use it later?
Yes, you can freeze it and it'll last, I would say probably about 4 or 5 days at most.
Okay, and if you freeze it, what kind of container are you putting it in to freeze it?
I would put it like in one of those round, like kind of deep size, kind of like if you were to get like takeout that's much longer in height, I would do it in that just to make sure. I think Ziploc has like ones that are, I think I have one over here. Let me show you. Kind of like this size. I would, because this is actually freezer proof as well. So you could just pour it in here and then close it with the lid and store it, and it'll store upright.
Beautiful. I do know people who put soup directly into a Ziploc bag and freeze it, and that works too. So
yeah,
there are a few
that
options.
saves a lot more space too, because you can lie it flat.
Right. And Haiti, thank you, is saying that it's very true that if you make your own soup, you get more for your money.
True.
Very important to know how to make affordable, healthy food. We don't need to rely on other people to do that for us. And that's why Bronx Eats is here. We show you just how easy it is to make these things for yourself, and you'll have way more food and you'll pay way less. So isn't that a great way to spend an hour to learn how to do that for yourself?
Exactly. So in my pot right now, I'm heating it up. So I'm gonna add a little bit of, I'm using actually avocado oil. The recipe says olive oil, but I don't have any olive oil. So as long as you can, it's a healthier cooking oil, you can use it. So we're just gonna pour a little bit into the pot because we're gonna actually saute the onions now. So we're gonna let that heat up for a little bit. And then I'll saute the onions and the garlic. So this will definitely bring out a lot of flavor. And the key to cooking the onions is that you don't want to brown them. You want them to sweat. So you want them to become more of a translucent color. So that's, if you ever hear the word sweat, that's what it means. It's just to, make them translucent cooked, but you're not browning them. You're not, or caramelizing them. So I'm going to add the onions. And then I'm going to also add the garlic. So we want to cook the onions and the garlic together. So I have the heat about medium to high heat. So you could do that too. You just have to watch it and make sure it doesn't burn. And also another way you can cook the onions and the garlic, if you're trying to reduce your oil consumption, you can water saute it. So what that is instead of putting oil, you would put water in it and saute the onions in water. So it's actually a much healthier option to do.
So right now, you're using oil to cook the onions and the garlic. And you haven't added any water to the pot, right? There's a question about how much water is in the pot. I think none yet, right?
Right, none yet. We just added the oil only, and it's about 1 to 2 tablespoons of oil.
Beautiful.
So you can sort of see that it's starting to get, like the onions are starting to get shiny. So that's actually what we want. We want them to be shiny and translucent. So what I'm going to do now is actually add the apples to it. And just kind of combine everything and start cooking them. So you want the apples, you want to cook them that they're a little bit soft so that when you add the water and everything else in it, it'll continue cooking with the broth.
So I noticed, Desiree, that you're not timing anything right now. You're just kind of, there's flexibility. You're watching the onions until they get a little soft. You're adding the apples and saying, wait until they're a little soft. So it sounds like, it doesn't have to be like the way with baking. You have to be very, very precise or it's going to come out terrible.
Right.
Whereas with this, you can kind of follow your instinct a little bit. I mean,
Exactly.
you're saying, please make sure not to burn it, but otherwise, if you're watching it and, moving along with the steps, you don't need a timer. You don't need to, worry that you're going to do anything terrible.
Exactly. I mean, usually when I use the timer, it's for like when it's going to cook all together. So that's when I'll use a timer. And even then I'll check it beforehand. I'll never just let it, let me go, whatever time it says. I'll always check it ahead of time. Sometimes it's already cooked. And ovens and stoves are all different. Everyone has a different stove. So what may take 20 minutes on my stove may take 15 minutes on yours. So you also, you have to always err on the side of caution whenever reading certain recipes, especially when it tells you to cook it for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, and trust your instinct, right?
Right.
Just because the recipe says 20 minutes, if you notice, well, my squash is already soft and cooked and ready, then 15 minutes may be enough.
Right.
So it's the heat may be higher on one stove or lower on another stove, so there can be variation in how long things take.
So I'm going to actually start adding some of the spices to it. So I'm adding right here, this is sage, ground sage. Definitely good for, a fall recipe. I'm going to do a little bit of cinnamon. A dash of nutmeg. And I'm going to start off with a half a teaspoon of salt. I'll check it later on if it needs more, but you always want to start out with a little bit and then check it later on if you want, if it needs more, because sometimes it doesn't need more. I'm going to add broth and a few other things. So that will have salt in it already. And some of the ingredients already have sodium in it. So you don't want to go too much on the salt. And then I'm going to add some black pepper as well.
That's great. And I love all the spices in this soup. Can you talk a little bit about why it's such a great idea to cook with spices?
Definitely, because with spices, you get so much flavor. A lot of people, are hesitant to transition to a plant-based diet because they think the food is bland. Spices actually just give it the flavor, it just enhances it so much that you don't really need any, you don't need other unhealthy ingredients to add to it. Simple spices, they're natural, they're easy to get, just definitely enhance, and they actually bring out more flavor from the ingredients itself. Like it'll bring out more the apple flavors and the flavor of the butternut squash and the carrots as well.
And many herbs and spices can really be very medicinal, right? Really help our immune systems, really help fight cancer. I know turmeric, for example, is a big anti-carcinogen, and all of the sage and the nutmeg and all of these things are really just excellent for building immune health and gut health. So we don't need to just stick to salt and pepper. We can get a little adventurous.
So I'm going to check on my apples here to see if they're, they're getting a little soft. They're still a little hard. So I'll probably leave it here for 5 minutes, just cooking before. But I don't know if you can see, like some of the spices are sticking to the bottom of the pot. So what I'm going to do is just deglaze it with a little bit of water. So what deglazing does is actually takes, like if you have hard pieces, let's say of seasoning or even food on your pot, deglazing will help lift it up and you combine it into the food. So you can still get all that flavor that's stuck on the pot. So I'm gonna add a little bit of water and kind of just scrape it with my spoon up and combine it into the apples and the onions. So that, because you don't want to leave, that's flavor right there. You don't want to leave that behind.
Yeah, that's a great trick, the deglazing, right? You don't want to leave your
Yes.
spices in the pot, or you've lost some of your delicious taste. So,
Right.
and again, adding a little water is not going to change the soup so dramatically or mess it up. People tend to be, until they try doing this, they tend to be very nervous about it. But you can see Desiree is kind of, saying, well, wait, it's a little stuck to the pan. I can add a little water. It'll be fine.
Exactly. So I'm going to cook it for about 5 more minutes. And also you could deglaze it with the broth, because the broth would also add some more flavor to it as well. So I'm just going to add a little bit more water because it's sticking a little bit as it cooks. So you could just have it because you don't want it to dry out either.
So Desiree, there is a question about fresh salvia and how to dry it. Can you use fresh salvia in soup, or do you need to dry it?
You can use fresh. If you use fresh, you may have to use more of it because it's not dried out. As opposed to dried, you could just use whatever is, in the recipe, whatever the measurement calls for. So you can use both in the soup. It's better to use fresh because, of course, it's fresher as opposed to the dried that's probably been grounded and, who knows when that was grounded, pulverized. So always fresher is better, but if you don't have it, you could use dry. That's not a problem. So I'm just gonna actually get my butternut squash and carrots ready because those are pretty much tender already. I'll show you those. So this has been boiling in just regular water. And I'm gonna test it here with my fork. So it's very soft. So what I'm gonna do here is drain it and get it ready. So when this is done, we'll combine it and build the soup. So I'm gonna go here and drain it in my sink. And another trick you can do is when you're draining the squash and the carrots, you can actually save the water because that also has the flavor of the butternut squash and the carrots. So if you ever need to add more water to the soup, you could use it from there.
And what is that you drained it into?
I drained it actually into another bowl. So this is a strainer. And then there's another bowl in the sink here that has all of the water. So it's catching all of the water here. Okay,
so that's a great tip, right? She's draining her vegetables into a colander so the water gets out, but she's saving the water so that she can use that as part of her broth.
Right. And then you can also make your own broth too, just by boiling scraps of vegetables, when you cut like the cuttings, like you could take the, skins of the apple or the butternut squash and just make your own broth as well.
Yeah, that's a whole nother class, but I love that.
Yeah.
I love that idea. There is a question, if you could speak a little bit about what is salvia. Peggy would love a little explanation on that.
Salvia, I'm actually not too familiar with. I believe it's a type of herb, but I'm not sure exactly. I don't have too much information on that.
Yeah, its leaves are consumed by chewing or as a tea, or people sometimes smoke it. It actually has opioid-like compounds that sometimes lead to hallucinations. But I think for our purposes, it's a spice like any other. I don't think it's as common as many of the other spices, but it's very cool that you're using it.
So I would say, let me check on these apples. Now, I'm not too worried about making sure that they're like really, really soft at this moment, because once they're in the broth, they're going to continue cooking. So they'll get very soft anyway.
So that's kind of a two-step process, what you're saying. They're not fully cooked, but that's okay because you're going to keep cooking them.
Right. You're going to keep cooking them in the soup.
Right. And Giselle, I think you had an announcement.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. There's going to be a link in the chat. If you can fill it out as a feedback, to give us feedback on like this class, as well as any future classes that you like to see. It takes only a few minutes, no more than 5 minutes. It's a very simple survey. So that would be greatly appreciated if you can quickly fill that out. It just helps us. I just entered the chat now.
All right, so I'm going to add actually now the butternut squash and the carrots into it. And I'm gonna add the broth. So I'm actually using low sodium vegetable broth because I want to control the salt in this. So I'm putting about 4 to 6. So as you can see here, the broth doesn't quite cover it yet. So I'll have a little bit more on hand. I'm going to add to it. So you want it to cover the vegetables. And this is actually the broth that I'm using. If you find it, it's a really, really good broth. A lot of the times with low sodium broth, they don't have a lot of flavor. This particular brand, Pacific Foods, actually has flavor to it. So a lot of times, that's what they make, how they make broths flavorful is that they add a lot more salt to it, which you don't want. You want to be able to control the salt in any dish. So that's actually one brand I do recommend if you're looking for low sodium vegetable broth. So I'm just combining everything together, and I'm actually going to set a timer for 20 minutes. So all the flavors are going to blend together, and we'll have a soup pretty much in 20 minutes.
Beautiful. Desiree, there's a question about whether you used fresh sage or dried sage.
I use dried.
Okay. And if somebody has fresh or is growing that in their garden or has that in a planter in their home, can they use that as well?
Yes, they can. That is definitely probably the way to go. So while the soup cooks, we're going to bring it to a boil. So right now, after I added everything, it's not boiling yet. So we're going to just bring up the heat a little bit. And once it starts boiling in 20 minutes, it'll pretty much be done. So what I'm going to do actually is let you know about an immersion blender. So when blending the soup, I have here an immersion blender. So this actually will be a lot space saving compared to a regular blender. And what an immersion blender does is actually has a blade here, and it pretty much chops down all the food. So that's why you want to make sure all of the vegetables, everything that's in the soup is very well cooked, because it has a small opening. So it's not as, big of a space as a blender would take to chop everything down, but this will still chop it down and make it into a smooth texture. So this actually comes with a few accessories. Usually comes with a whisk and a little container. So you can also use it as a regular blender to make smoothies and other things that you would need a blender for. So definitely I recommend getting one if you don't have a blender. If you do have a blender, then just use the soup when it's time to blend. You would just do it in batches to make sure everything is smooth, with a nice smooth texture.
And
So
another
definitely-
reason why people use the immersion blender is because you don't have to take the soup out of the pot, right? You're going to put the immersion blender directly into the pot, and people kind of like that because you don't have to fuss with getting the soup out into another.
Exactly.
Another container.
And it's less things to wash as well, because then you have to, wash the blender, you have to wash the pots and everything. So definitely this is a much easier tool to do, to use when you're blending soup. So I'm going to get this ready here. And what you want to do is once the soup is pretty much almost ready, you want to kind of check it for seasoning. You want to make sure that it has enough seasoning. If not, you could add some towards the end. But that would be for later. And also, what we can do is, in the meantime, while we're waiting for the soup to get ready, I'm going to chop some parsley. So it's just a nice garnish to it. And I have actually my parsley like this, kind of like in a little jar as like a flower, because actually this makes it stay, preserves the parsley or any herbs that you buy fresh much longer. So it's still a plant. The herbs are a plant, still needs water. So instead of just, throwing them in your drawer or just leaving them in the plastic that they may come in, you could just take them out, put some water, fresh water in a jar and put them here, and then just cover it so that makes sure with a plastic bag to make sure nothing gets to it or, crushes it on top of it. But I'm going to take some here and just start chopping them.
That's a great tip. And some people wrap their parsley with some moistened paper towel and just wrap it up. It's another way to give moisture.
I
to
just threw it away after making chicken soup.
And again, whatever's fresh is always very healthy, very medicinal, and very much worth putting into soups, salads. Parsley can be added to both and really gives it a lot of flavor, a lot of extra added vitamins and minerals.
Right.
I
And
never
even-
used cilantro, and since last week, I put it into my chicken soup. And I want you to know something, it's the best chicken soup I ever had.
Well, yeah, there you go. That's flavoring.
Yeah,
I
you
mean, all
learn,
of
I'm
the-
learning from you.
That's great. All of these store-bought broths that look clear, a lot of them have been cooked with parsley, cilantro, and then they strain it out. But that's what gives the broth, like chicken soup, the flavor. So that's great, Marcia. I love that.
Exactly.
This is Dale. I also discovered that the celery leaves could also be chopped up and used in a soup, couldn't it?
Yes.
Celery leaves, absolutely. Celery is a great vegetable for flavoring. You can use the celery leaf and you can also use the celery root. And both of them will really flavor the water of chicken soup or any other kind of soup you're making.
And celery is used as a lot of times as a base for soups as well. It's one of the 3 main ingredients that go into a lot of soups: onions, celery, and carrots. So I'm going to check on the soup to make sure. So the soup is now boiling. So that's exactly what we want. So you just kind of want to leave it there, stir it every once in a while, just to make sure everything is combined. But really, you're just waiting for the soup to, all the flavors to combine and for the apples to soften. And pretty much
So you're
your
not
soup.
keeping it on a high boil, Desiree, is that right?
Right. So I have my flame about medium heat, medium high.
So you brought it to a high boil and then you lowered the flame?
Yeah. So we're just gonna let it there, pretty much simmer for another, 10, 15 minutes. But
And you're not covering it? Would it be a problem if you wanted to cover it?
no, it wouldn't. It actually will keep everything contained, all the heat will stay inside and actually cook faster. So we're just gonna check on it every once in a while. Because you definitely want it to cook all the way through. So we have actually also too, you could use croutons as a topping if you want, and you can make your own, which is actually really, really easy to do. You could just take, some sliced bread, cut it into pieces and toss it in a little bit of olive oil and some, I usually use Italian seasoning, and put in the oven for about 15, 20 minutes until they get toasted, and you have homemade croutons that you can use as a topping for this soup as well.
Yeah, that's really going to create a wow factor. If you make your own homemade croutons and put that on top of the soup, it'll really have a, especially if it's fresh out of the oven, you'll have this warm flavored croutons with your fresh soup. It's going to have a whole different taste than croutons out of the package.
Exactly. And then actually for the soup at the end, what I'm going to do is actually add some plant-based creamer. So I have here, I know how the Bronx can be if they don't have everything. So this is the brand I'm using at the moment is Silk. This is half and half. It's dairy-free and plant-based. But if you don't have this, you could always use unsweetened soy milk, unflavored. I'm sorry, unflavored. It's always important to make sure you're not putting like vanilla creamer into your soup. You don't want to change the flavor of the soup, but you can use this Silk half and half, or coconut milk is also another option that's, you know, easily accessible that you can use to kind of just make it creamier. That's what you're adding this creamer for, is to make the soup creamy. So when you're blending it, it'll have the nice creamy texture that you want and smooth texture.
But it's important to notice that you're not adding that creamer until the soup is fully cooked, right? You're waiting
Right.
until it's cooked. You have your creamer ready, but it's really after it's fully cooked that you're adding whatever you choose, the coconut milk or half and half or dairy-free.
Exactly.
Creamer.
Yeah, we're gonna add this at the end once the soup is blended. So it's kind of like a nice finishing touch to it.
And there is a question about what temperature you set the oven at to make the croutons.
The croutons, you can do it at 400. And then I would say at 10 minutes, watch it to see. Sometimes it may need a little bit more, but definitely at 400, it'll get nice and toasty. Are there any more questions while we wait for the soup to, to cook?
If there are no more questions, I was just going to remind people that this soup, you can substitute sweet potatoes. You could substitute other kinds of squash. I'm trying to think of other things that could be substituted. I mean, of course, butternut squash is great because it's super affordable and super nutritious. But some people are a little bit intimidated by getting the skin off of it. But I think, as Desiree showed us, it's really not. It's not really that difficult.
Just using a regular vegetable peeler will do. It'll definitely take off all the skin.
And then you can feel like a vegetable champion, that you conquered your vegetable rather than letting it scare you in the supermarket.
I've learned a lot from her, from all of you. Cooking 65 years, so that's how long I was married.
Yeah. Well, sometimes these classes are inspiring because we get into a rut of cooking the same thing. And so seeing chefs and cooks showcase what they know and how to cook things that are, you know, that we could easily do, but we may not think of it because we just don't have it modeled. I think sometimes watching someone do it is easier than reading it in a cookbook.
I remember once going to a church for lunch, and they used that squash as a mashed potato, and it was delicious. So that butternut squash is very useful.
Yep. Somebody's saying, I've read that you could also use stale bread for croutons. Is there a specific type of bread this would work well with?
I've used pretty much any type of bread, because the thing with bread is, you know, a lot of it, we're all addicted to it, but a lot of it, you know, especially like white bread, doesn't have any nutritional value to it. So I usually use either multigrain or wheat, sliced wheat bread. So at least it's still a little bit healthier, and it'll still absorb the taste, and it'll be so much better. So I usually either use wheat bread. I'll take sliced bread, to, you know, whatever sliced bread I have on hand, and just chop it, you know, into square pieces, and then just toss it in the bowl with the olive oil with Italian seasoning. Or if you have a favorite seasoning of yours, you could do it. You could definitely customize it. You could use the everything bagel seasoning is also another great seasoning that usually a lot of people put on everything, like avocado toast and a bunch of other things. So you could actually pretty much get creative with it, with your croutons, and make your own and not have to buy it from the store.
There's a question from Mary. Does coconut change the flavor of the soup?
We're only putting 1/3 cup of it, so it's not going to completely change the flavor of it. So we're just putting a little bit. That's why I always, when you have like regular coffee creamer in hand, like I always recommend that whenever it's with cooking, you always use unflavored. So with coconut, yeah, sometimes if you put too much, it will definitely change it, but we're not going to put that much for the amount of soup that's in there.
Yeah, and I would just add that, some people really love the flavor of coconut. So adding that flavor is going to make it creamy and delicious and taste like a little bit like coconut. And similarly with almond milk or any milk that you're going to be putting in there, it will give it a little bit of flavor, but hopefully you're putting it in there because you like that flavor. I wouldn't add coconut milk if you don't like coconut flavor.
Right.
And nowadays, there are just so many dairy alternatives that it's easy to play around. Maybe you prefer oat milk. Maybe you prefer almond milk. Maybe you prefer coconut milk, right? That's kind of up to you. It's going to really only give it a hint of that flavor.
Exactly. Because you're using it more, the milk would be, or the creamer would be more just for the texture rather than the taste of it in the soup.
Whoa, we have a question from Stella about whether you can use buttermilk.
Buttermilk, I wouldn't recommend it. Well, also, normal buttermilk would come, from, it's made with regular milk and vinegar. So it will come from its dairy product. So since this soup is dairy free, we're trying to use more of the dairy free options. So I wouldn't recommend the buttermilk in this one. But you can make your own buttermilk if you want to. That's plant-based. So I'm actually just testing the apple, and the apple is pretty soft right now. So it's actually going to be time to blend it all together. So I'm going to turn it off, move it away from the heat a little bit. I'm going to move this pot over.
So can you put a fork in either the apple or the squash, or does it matter?
Yeah, you can test both to make sure, like you could test the carrots, as long as the fork can go through it easily, it's soft enough. So I'm going to actually take the immersion blender now, and we're going to blend it. So see, you would just put the immersion blender in and just press the button, and it'll just start blending it right away. So you want to make sure all of the chunks are cut down and smooth into the soup. So as you can see, as I'm blending it, you're starting to get like that dark orange coloring in the soup. So that's what you want. That's what you want to see, is that it's going to be a nice orange color.
So Desiree, I would just add to what you're saying that you're saying you should blend it until the chunks become smooth, but some people like little chunks in their soup. So if you're one of those people, you can blend it and leave some of it not smooth. And then when you're eating it, there'll be little pieces of the squash or little pieces of the apple, and that's
Right.
fine.
So it's based on your preference. If you like a chunkier soup, like Gail said, you could just leave it chunkier. If you want it smoother, then you would just blend it longer. So all the big pieces are really chopped down. So you can start seeing it starting to come together as more pieces are cut down.
Okay, well, while you are finishing to blend, I'm just gonna wrap this up here, and we can take a look at the final product in a minute. Thank you again so much for coming. We know that eating fruits and vegetables is the best medicine of all, and that consuming healthy, real food instead of processed food strengthens our bodies, our immune systems, and our moods. Diet is critical to preventing and even reversing many chronic diseases, including heart disease and diabetes. So let's learn how to make better food choices together. Let's do this for yourself, your community, your family, and the planet. It's not out of reach, and we can definitely do it together in community. And as Desiree has shown us, it's really definitely within your reach and something that will contribute to your health. Thank you again for joining us tonight. We're grateful that you're here. Remember to eat real food, stay healthy, and enjoy the rest of the month. And Desiree, let's see what you got.
So I added the creamer to it. So now see, it's even getting a little bit of a lighter color.
Yeah.
So I have it a little bit chunky here, but like I said before, you know, based on your preference, you want it slightly chunky, you can do it, or if not, you can, you know, do it smoother. So I'm just
So
gonna
I love this, and I just want to repeat what we said earlier, that using the immersion blender is great if you have one. If you have a regular blender, then when the food is cooked, when the soup was ready, you would just have to ladle it out into your blender and puree it and blend it in your blender. And that is exactly the same as using an immersion blender. So I
Exactly.
hope that answers your question, Dale.
This recipe is on the computer.
You should
Is
all
it-
have received a copy of the recipe because you're already.
Okay, I
Look
didn't
at that,
notice it.
finishing touches with the parsley. That makes it look really professional. Absolutely beautiful, Desiree.
Thank you so much. And it's, you know, very delicious soup, you know, especially it's going to get cold soon. I know in New York, this is like the perfect dish to just, you know, you can have it on hand, make a big batch, and then you can have it throughout the week for lunch or dinner and just stay warm.
So beautiful. Thank you so much. I hope you guys will all repeat this, and you can see how delicious it looks in the little box, but you got to be able to taste it and smell it for yourself. So please go and make it yourself. And thank you again, Desiree, for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.